Beautiful evening where it'd be nice just to stay out in the sun. Beautiful evening. Instead, you're here having your minds illumined, strengthened. You'll be wiser when you leave tonight because of your time spent here. The goal, really, of the Lumen Lecture Series is to do, in many ways, just that. By bringing in top-notch Christian scholars in various fields to speak to different areas related to faith and living, to help us integrate our faith and learning. And in many ways, I'm wanting you to be exposed to some broader perspectives, some other perspectives. And tonight's guest lecturer fits the bill and continues a series of excellent speakers that we've had this school year, including Steve Garber, Stanley Hauerwas, Charles Marsh, and now Dr. James K.A. Smith. Dr. Smith is a professor of philosophy at Calvin College. He holds the Gary and Henrietta Biker Chair in Applied Reformed Theology and Worldview. He also serves as the editor of Comment Magazine. That's Comment Magazine, so as you get ready for your prescriptions, your subscriptions, be sure to subscribe to that. It might work as a prescript, too. Anyway, he's also a senior fellow at the Colossian Forum. He's a native of Embro, Ontario. His PhD is earned from Villanova University. Dr. Smith works at the intersection of philosophy, theology, and cultural criticism. He's an award-winning author of numerous books, including 3 which we have for sale in the back here tonight, including Desiring the Kingdom and Imagining the Kingdom. Both those books touch on are on the same subject about which he'll be speaking tonight. He's also the author of the following books: Who's Afraid of Postmodernism? Who's Afraid of Relativism? Letters to a Young Calvinist. And most recently, a book that engages the work of philosopher Charles Taylor, How Not to Be Secular. He's also the author of numerous scholarly articles and more popular level articles in magazines such as Christianity Today, First Things, Books and Culture, Christian Century, and The Banner. One collection of his popular writings is titled The Devil Reads Derrida. Jamie and his wife Deanna are elementary school sweethearts, and they have 4 children who make their living in Grand Rapids, Michigan. Would you please join me in welcoming Dr. James K.A. Smith.
Thanks, brother. Great, thank you. Good evening, everyone. I'm really honored that you would choose this over that. So thanks so much for being here. And I want to think with you a bit tonight. Does everybody have an outline to help you doodle when you get bored? My topic is You Are What You Love. And what I want us to think about for a little while tonight is what I'm going to call an alternative model of the human person. That is, I want us to think about what we are a little bit differently. Because I think that will make a difference in at least 2 areas, or has implications for 2 different areas. On the one hand, I do think that this, if you retool what we think human beings are, it changes the way that you think about spiritual growth, formation, and discipleship. So it has implications for our sort of religious lives. On the other hand, though, I also want us to see that there's a kind of outward-looking implication of this, which is, depending on how you view human persons, affects what you think is involved in cultural analysis and criticism. So part of what I want to do is equip you with a more robust, holistic account of what human beings are in order to give you a more, what would you say, a more widely calibrated radar for cultural analysis. But then I also want us to think through why that has implications for the way we approach our Christian lives, the way we think about spiritual formation and discipleship. What difference does it make if we say that you are what you love? So let me say, that involves pushing back on a kind of default model of the human person that I think many of us unwittingly assume, even though we often don't articulate it. And I would say, especially for those of us who maybe come out of Protestant Christian traditions, we have a tendency to assume that human beings are primarily thinking things. That is, we have a little bit of a default tendency to assume that what defines the human person are the ideas and beliefs that we hold, and we treat those as the most essential aspect of the human person, and so we turn out to be kind of practically rationalistic. Even if we are anti-intellectual, the irony is that you can be anti-intellectual and actually have a very heady, mind-centric, thinking thing picture of the human person. Because what happens is by some sort of default, we end up assuming that the human person is kind of this container for ideas and beliefs and knowledge and doctrine. And so what we assume then is that, say, discipleship is depositing all the right ideas and beliefs into your intellectual receptacle, and that's how one becomes a disciple. That's how one becomes Christ-like. It's a matter of acquiring the right information. So I remember being struck several years ago, seeing an ad in Christianity Today magazine. It was an advertisement for a Bible memory verse program. And emblazoned across the man's forehead were the words, "You are what you think." You are what you think, right? And if you assume you are what you think, and you want to learn how to be a Christian, right? If you want to become a disciple of Jesus, then you will assume that what you need to do is deposit all the right information in your head so that you think the right things, and boom, you will be Christ-like. You are what you think. Here's the problem with that model. Do any of you know things that you don't do? Do any of you experience a gap between the information that you understand and the way of life that you live? Or have you ever had the experience of, you hear Dr. Huggins preach this unbelievable message on a Sunday night. You're so convicted, right? You completely understand and you see something the way you've never ever seen it before. And you're intellectually convinced. And so you resolve on Monday morning, this part of my life is going to change. And then by about Thursday, you're back where you were. That thinking has not proved to be adequate to actually transform who you are. And all I want to say is, I'm a philosopher, I get paid to think, I love thinking. But I actually, as a philosopher, I want to make an argument for why you are not just what you think. You are more than what you think. And you might not even be fundamentally what you think. Instead, I want to suggest an alternative model of the human person that isn't this kind of brain on a stick picture. I think a lot of us who are Protestants have assumed a kind of default brain on a stick picture of the human person, and therefore we've assumed it's all about information. I want us to zoom out and try to cultivate a completely different model of the human person, which instead of envisioning the person as this thinking thing, which is a static sort of intellectual container for the right ideas and beliefs and doctrines, what I want us to think about what difference it would make if we understand the center of the human person in the biblical language of the heart. But before we build that picture, so imagine it this way. Instead of thinking about the human person as this kind of static container for a bunch of beliefs and ideas, let's start with a more dynamic picture which emphasizes that the human person is what we're going to call an intentional being. Now, intentional here means, it comes from the Latin word intentio. This is why you're paying all this money for tuition, so you can go home and tell your parents you learned Latin, okay? Intentio means to aim. So to be intentional creatures is to be kinds of creatures who are always aimed in some direction. You are oriented to some end. You are after something. You are sort of on the way to somewhere, right? So to be human is to be the kinds of creatures who are aimed towards some end, some telos, some goal, some project, right? And There are many different ways to sort of aim at the world, to intend the world. But I want to suggest that the most fundamental mode in which we aim at something ultimate is love. So that instead of you are what you think, in fact, the heart and core of who you are is what you love. Because see, think of it this way. If I really want to know who you are, right? Like if I really want to dig down and understand what makes you tick, I'm not going to ask you the question, what do you know? Right? Because there are just a gazillion things that you know, and if you reported to me all those things that you know, it actually doesn't get to the heart of who you are. I might not even ask you the question, what do you believe? If I really wanted to dive down and understand the core of who you are, here's the question I want you to answer. What do you want? What do you want? What do you long for? What do you crave? What do you desire? Right? It's not you are what you think, it's you are what you long for. You are what you love. You are what you desire. And one of the things I want us to sort of try to appreciate this evening is I want to use these words synonymously. Love, desire, longing, craving. I want us to think of all of those terms as roughly synonymous. And in order to sort of appreciate that, we have to overcome some bad habits that we've inherited from somewhere, where we have tended to treat love as agape. How many have ever heard the Greek word agape? Sort of, and you've maybe heard that even described as like sort of biblical love or Christian love or something like that. And so we have this sense that, well, true love is agape, and then there's another word for love that's phileo, which is a kind of friendship love, and then there's a third word for love in Greek that we're not supposed to talk about, because the word is eros. That's got to be bad, right? Eros, erotic, desire, craving. And somehow we've inherited this kind of dichotomy between those two things. But what I want to suggest to you tonight is that agape is rightly ordered eros. Okay? It's not eros that's the problem, it's what we eros, right? It's what we desire, it's what we crave. That to be made in the image of God is actually to be made as creatures who long, who hunger, who desire, who crave. And that the right ordering of our loves is precisely the reordering of our desire, not the turning off of our desire. So, how are we doing? Okay? Let me add one more layer to this particular piece of it. So I'm suggesting that what really makes you who you are is this orientation to something ultimate that really is a mode of love, of longing, and of desire. That to be human is to be a lover, is to be an erotic creature of a sort. St. Augustine, in the very opening paragraph of his classic, The Confessions, which you should all read before you leave Berry College. The whole of his Confessions is framed as a prayer, but in the very opening paragraph he says this: "You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you." Okay? So he's praying to God, and he says, you have made us for yourself. Now notice there's a design claim there. You have made us for something, right? There's a purpose, there's an end, there's a goal. You have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. So what I find fascinating is that for Augustine, the seat of finding myself, you could say, is actually located in this dynamic of my loves. It's located in the heart. It's not primarily and only an intellectual question that he has to solve. It's not an intellectual riddle that he's looking for the answer to. It's actually this existential craving that he's trying to make sense of and get a handle on. And he says, you have made us for yourself, and our hearts, this sort of visceral core of the human person, our hearts are restless until they rest in you. So imagine that every human being is the kind of being that has been made to love God and desire and long for God, and that is a part of being a creature. That's a good feature of being a creature. It's a good creature feature, right? However, that means that every human being is oriented by this sort of visceral, almost kind of tactile, gut-level longing and craving and desiring for the ultimate. But that ultimate that we are made to crave is God himself, is the Creator himself. Now, what would be the effect, say, of sin and fallenness and brokenness on that structure of the human person, right? Every human being is created as a lover. To be human is to be a lover, is to be a desirer. What is the effect of sin and fallenness and brokenness on that? It's not that you stop loving, right? The effect of sin is not that you turn off that craving or longing. The effect of sin and brokenness and disorder is that our loves get misdirected, right? You can't not love if you are a human being. The question is not whether you love, the question is what you are going to love, and to what ultimate end we live our lives oriented towards. Right? Everybody with me so far? Okay, last piece of this picture that I want us to think through. So, the long Christian tradition from Augustine up through Aquinas, even into John Calvin and others, has always emphasized that love is a habit. Love is a habit. It's a disposition. It's a virtue. Okay? Now, what that means then is love is the kind of dispositional orientation that is formed in you and inscribed in you by your immersion in rhythms and routines and practices that train your loves, right? Because if you are what you love, and to be human is to always be someone who is on the way towards and longing for some version of the good life, some ultimate vision of what flourishing is. If that is just a structural characteristic of being human. But we also understand that our loves can actually be misdirected and disordered and oriented towards rival visions of the good life, rival gods, you could say. Then we need to ask ourselves, well, how does my love get aimed, right? How does my love get oriented? How does my love get directed towards certain ends, towards a certain telos? And the answer to that is, it's not through the information that you've received. It's actually an effect of the formations that you have been immersed in. That because love is a habit, what that means is the rhythms and routines and rituals that constitute the sort of rhythms of your life are training your loves and longings at a kind of subterranean, pre-conscious level. And in ways you might not even realize, you are learning to love some vision of the good life, some version of human flourishing. So what we need to start attending to is, in fact, the practices that we are immersed in. The social, communal routines and rituals that aren't just something that we do, but in fact do something to us. That's what I mean by formative practices, right? Our loves are formed and aimed and trained not just by the knowledge we acquire, not even primarily by the knowledge we acquire, but by the practices that I am immersed in. And those practices don't just provide information, they are the formation that is training me what to love. So practices aren't just something that we do, they do something to us. I want to use the word liturgy as a kind of shorthand term to describe the most potent, love-shaping practices, right? Now, I know liturgy is kind of a churchy, traditional sort of word, and I'm actually trying to unhook it from that specific kind of churchy resonance, because I want to use the word liturgy now in a more broadly, just though to help us wake up to the fact that cultural practices that we are immersed in are not neutral and benign, but in fact can have a love-shaping power about them such that they are training our hearts even when we don't realize it. Does that make sense? So don't think of, if liturgies are social practices, communal rituals that come loaded with a vision of the good life, and in which we are immersed and are training our loves and longings, if that's what a liturgy is, then there are liturgies everywhere. Right? What you have to recognize is there are rival liturgies everywhere. That we live at this intersection of competing liturgies. So liturgies aren't just sequestered within the walls of the church sanctuary. Liturgies are at work all throughout our cultural experience. And what that means then is that there is something at stake in our cultural participation and immersion that we wouldn't have noticed otherwise. Does that make sense? Right? So if you only think of human beings as thinking things, right? If you think that human beings are just brains on a stick and you are what you think, then the way you analyze culture, the way you sort of are culturally aware, is you're going to kind of track and be listening for the messages of culture, the ideas of culture, the sort of doctrines, the rival doctrines that are on offer in culture. But if you do that, what you will end up missing, in fact, are all kinds of formative practices that don't give a rip about your head, but are trying to get hold of your heart. And they're operating under the radar of your cultural awareness. So, what I want us to start thinking about and appreciating is, you are what you love. What you love is an effect of a formation that you receive that is training your love as habit. Those habits are formed by the practices that you are immersed in. And those practices form you on a register, on a level, so to speak, that sometimes almost intentionally bypasses the mind and the intellect. So this leads us to our second point. You are what you love, but you might not love what you think. See, because here's the thing. If I asked you all, what do you want, right? My question. If I asked you, what do you really, what do you want and long for? You all probably know the answer you're supposed to give me. But is that the real answer? Do we even know what we want? See, if our loves are shaped and trained and formed by the liturgies, the practices that we are immersed in, and if we haven't recognized those as formative liturgies, we might not even realize the extent to which we have been misformed, deformed by rival liturgies. There's this fascinating and completely minor fringe movie by a Russian director named Andrei Tarkovsky. This is for you guys who laugh because I refer to movies that nobody has ever heard of. But Tarkovsky has this 1979 film called Stalker. I'm not going to rehearse the whole thing, but there is this really interesting bit. Let me see if I can get you up to speed. So, Stalker is the story of this guide who is leading two figures into what's called the zone, so that they can ultimately reach a place called the room. All right, so you've got the stalker, the guide, who is leading two figures. One is the writer and one is the professor. Right, so do whatever Freudian psychoanalysis you want here. And the professor and the writer have signed up to be guided by the stalker, who is taking them into this zone. It's this kind of sci-fi post-apocalyptic vision that's going on. And in the zone is the room. And the reason why everybody wants to go to the room is because in the room you get what you want. Right? This is like the room of requirement in Harry Potter times 10 or something, right? Like you don't just get what you need, you get what you want. So who wouldn't want to go there? So they have a long, arduous journey, make their way. Finally, they get to the threshold of the room, and the stalker turns to the professor and the writer. He says, "Here we are. This is your chance. Who's going first? Walk through, you'll get what you want. We've arrived." Neither one of them will walk through the door. Why? Because all of a sudden they become conscious that they might not want what they think. And the room knows what they really want. So when you go into the room, you don't get to make a request. When you walk into the room knows what you really want. You don't walk in and say, "I want a Lexus." You walk in and the room already knows what you really want, and both the professor and the writer are all of a sudden deeply conscious of the fact that they might not even realize what they really want. Because their wants have been formed by practices that they haven't even been aware of, right? It's that kind of space. You are what you love, but you might not love what you think, because you might not realize that you have been habituated to fundamental and ultimate desires that were working on you below the radar of your awareness. Right? So you can, there's actually really interesting stuff about this in contemporary neuroscience and cognitive psychology about the way automation happens, right? So there's interesting discussions about the fact that you can, the way you acquire these habits. Okay, I'm getting all excited. Hang on, let me back up for a second. So imagine that consciousness is like the proverbial iceberg. Okay? And the tip of that iceberg of your consciousness is the part of your daily actions where you actually consciously think about and choose what you're going to do. Right? You make a choice, you think about your options, you deliberate about what you're going to do. And a lot of the research, Timothy Wilson at the University of Virginia wrote a book called Strangers to Ourselves, in which he suggests that about 5 to 7% of what you do in a given day is chosen deliberately and consciously. Do you understand the implication here? That means 90 something. I'm a philosophy major. More than 90% of what you do in a given day is unconscious and automated behavior. It's not instinct. We're not talking about your knee snapping. We're talking about ways that you have acquired habits for navigating the world without having to think about it, because these have become automated. How did they become automated? Because you've done them over and over and over again, so that now you don't have to execute them with the executive function of consciousness. You can just manage it. So an easy example is, I don't know if some of you can probably still remember learning how to drive and one of your parents being terrified in the passenger seat and trying to help you with that. So think of when a teenager is learning to drive, every aspect of driving is actually managed in that tip of the iceberg of conscious deliberative choice. That's why it's so terrifying, right? Because when you have to think about, okay, I've checked my mirror, where's the blinker, here's the gas pedal, right? You have to think about, consciously deliberate about every aspect of the multiplicity of actions it takes to drive. It's exhausting. Absolutely exhausting. Contrast that with old fogies like us, who have a department meeting on a Thursday afternoon that just ticks us off. This guy's really grating on my nerves, and you stomp out and you're sort of grinding your teeth and you can't believe this, and you get in the car and you're still thinking about it. You can't believe that she said that and he said that, and then before you know it, you're sitting in your driveway and you don't remember driving home. Okay? Why does that happen? Because in fact, you have run through that routine so many times that your ability to navigate the world as a driver has been completely automated into your unconscious. And now that's sort of being processed more like a feel for the world than a conscious deliberative process that you have to undertake. Okay, think about the spiritual implications of this, for example. How do you acquire those kind of automaticities? Well, on the one hand, you could intentionally immerse yourself in practices so that because you want those things to be automated. How many of you here can play a musical instrument? Okay? Every single one of you, either you made a choice or probably somebody made a choice for you, that you are going to be submitted to a regimen, a formative regimen of practice, so that you could get to the point where eventually your fingers can do it without you having to think about it. That's the goal. Okay, here's the disconcerting insight from social psychology. You can also unintentionally require automaticities. If you are immersed in formative practices and you didn't know they were formative practices, right? If you are immersed in rhythms and routines and rituals that are shaping your habits and you didn't know it, they still have a formative impact. And what I want to suggest is that has significance for how we think about our spiritual formation. It also has significance for how we think about our spiritual deformation. If my loves have been captive or captivated by rival visions of the good life, by rival gods, it's not often because I have consciously chosen to pursue them. It's more like because my imagination has been captured by a rival story that is carried in these rituals and practices. And before I know it, I don't even realize that those have become automated inclinations and dispositions for me. You can't think your way out of that situation. You can't simply get the right information to undo that habituation. You have to be rehabituated. You have to get new habits, which means that you need new practices. I'll give you a mildly embarrassing example of this. So, my wife is kind of a food Nazi. You know, she's a foodie. So she's like, she cares a lot about good food and eating well and eating justly. Do you know what I mean? So she cares about good eating in both the sense of like healthy, good food for you, and also good eating in the sense of like just systems of food production and distribution. So she loves like Michael Pollan and Barbara Kingsolver and Wendell Berry and things like that. And what's interesting is, so you know, we only have like happy cows in our freezer because they like lived delightful lives, roaming free range, and right before they were killed, they were so happy, and that releases apparently just beautiful things that makes them tasty. And anyway, so, okay. So Deanne has been like an evangelist for this way of relating to food and food systems for a decade. And being the obstinate husband that I am, I don't often sort of, you know, it wasn't getting through to me. But eventually she convinced me to read this brilliant book by Wendell Berry called Bringing It to the Table. And it's about all these issues. And I start reading it. For a while, it was like the book I always carried with me somewhere. And I start reading it, and I'm like, this is brilliant. This is fantastic. And my wife hates this because he's not saying anything she hasn't said for 10 years, but now all of a sudden I'm listening to it. And so I'm marking this up. I'm like, yeah, check marks, you know, yes, stars, amen, all these kinds of things. I'm like totally convicted by what Wendell Berry is saying, and I get it, and I'm convinced, and I understand the argument, and he's totally won me over intellectually. And then one day, I have one of these, you know, these pensive moments where you read something, you're like, huh, right? You're sort of thinking about it, and I look around, and I realize I'm reading Wendell Berry in the food court at Costco. Now, if you don't know Wendell Berry, the food court at Costco is like the sixth circle of hell. Like, it's like everything that is wrong with the world of food consumption, production, distribution, health, all those kinds of things. Here I'm reading Wendell Berry, nodding in agreement with one of those huge foot-long hot dogs from Costco, and I'm thinking, there's a gap here, right? There's some sort of disconnect between my intellectual conviction and what I want, right? It's still what it is the gap between what I want. And what it's going to take to retrain my wants is not more information from Wendell Berry. It's going to take new practices that retrain my longings. It's a longer story we can talk about in Q&A if you want. It turned out that that was Weight Watchers. But anyway, I digress. Okay, but there's actually a really interesting story about how Weight Watchers, for me, has been its own regimen, its own discipline. You know, the way we use the word spiritual disciplines, it's actually a discipline that has now made me want different things. Right? So if you would have told me a year ago that I would want Greek yogurt, or that I would want a salad at lunch, I would have laughed in your face. But now my wants have been re-habituated. Anyway, sorry, enough Jamie sort of food issues. So, you might not love what you think because you might not realize the extent to which these rival liturgies have been at work on you in an unconscious way. That's the realization. So now what I want us to gain is a kind of new lens to look at our own cultural immersion and realize that things we thought we were just doing are actually doing something to us. And that what's at stake in some of our cultural immersion is actually formative and maybe deformative, right? I don't want to prejudge, but we need to start asking those questions. So I want to introduce the idea of what I'm going to call secular liturgies. I'm not thrilled with the word or the coinage of the phrase, but it's just a way of trying to help us realize that there are cultural practices that have love-shaping power about them, which means their force is kind of religious. Do you know what I mean? By that I mean that these practices are getting at your cardia, as the New Testament puts it, your heart, your gut. And they are actually touching and shaping and forming and bending and training your loves and your longings. And when they do that, they are shaping you because you are what you love, right? So what I think that does is it gives us a different way to look at our cultural moment, our cultural institutions, our cultural practices, and to ask a different set of questions, right? The question we should ask of culture is not what are the ideas and beliefs and doctrines that are floating around out here. The questions we should be asking is, what does this cultural institution want me to become? What sort of person is it going to mold me into? What does it want me to love? What does it want me to love? That's the kind of exegesis of culture that we need to undertake. What does this cultural institution want us to love? So, I think this changes where you think, for lack of a better term, spiritual battles lie. Okay, I don't know. I'm not sold on that language, but what I mean by this is, so my oldest son, he and I used to get in these discussions about various things that you do with teenagers, and at one day I remember him distinctly saying, "Dad, will you take me to the temple?" And what he meant was, it's not that he had a Jewish friend, he was kind of slightly mocking me because he wanted me to take him to the mall. And we had had a conversation in which I had tried to explain to him that going to the mall is not a neutral, benign activity, because I was trying to impress upon him that the mall is one of the most intensely religious sites in any town, right? Not because the mall is preaching anything, right? Not because the mall is laden with messages. It's precisely because the mall is a liturgical experience that in my immersion in it is working not to try to convince my intellect, but is actually trying to capture my imagination and my longings and get me captivated by an alternative vision of the good life. So, and how does that work? It's not like when you arrive at the mall, somebody meets you at the door and says, here's the 16 things that the mall believes, right? I mean, the mall doesn't believe, the last thing the mall wants to do is want you to worry about what you believe, right? But the mall is quite an intentionally quasi-liturgical experience that is immersing you in a rhythm and rites that are trying to work on your imagination and appeal to you with a vision of what flourishing looks like, what the good life looks like. So think of it. I remember talking to an architectural historian at UVA who pointed out that there was actually intentional historic echoes between malls and medieval cathedrals. And that one of the ways that no mall is an accident, okay? And there are all kinds of ways in which this experience is meant to sort of capture our imagination and immerse us in a way of sort of inhabiting space and time. So for example, have you ever noticed that when you're inside a mall, once you're inside, you can't really see outside to the street or the parking lot? There might be these sort of Baroque folded skylights and stuff going on, but once you're in, you don't see outside. It's a sequestered space because you have just entered a different experience of time. And ideally, what will happen is you will lose track of time. That's the point. Have you also noticed that the mall has its own kind of liturgical calendar, right? The festal colors of a consumer cathedral. And it goes, February. What's the color at the mall in February? It's going to be red for Valentine's Day, right? And then we're going to move towards, pinks and pastels for Easter, and then, which is weird, why consumers' culture still evokes Easter. And then you're going to go to Mother's Day. It's the consumer hallmark liturgical calendar. Mother's Day, 4th of July, right? And it's incredible. It's got its own cycle of liturgical time that immerses you in a relationship to the world in which stuff is always available for you. And the way that the gospel of consumerism gets hold of our hearts is not by convincing our intellects, it's by shaping our wants and longings. And when I'm walking down the labyrinth of the mall, you know how in ancient medieval cathedrals there would have been stained glass in which the exemplars of holiness, the saints, were there for me to imitate. Well, the icons of the mall's liturgical experience are 3D mannequins that are dressed in the vision of the good whatever. I'm going to embarrass myself by trying to name some hip shop that I don't know. It's like Forever 21 or so. I know that's not it. But H&M. It's not H&M either, is it? But right and notice this is an ambiance. This is an environment. This is a sort of imaginative, aesthetic experience that is picturing a good life that now is seeping into you in ways that you don't even realize, because now you think that happiness is the acquisition of stuff. And the gospel of consumerism is predicated on novelty, because what you need is you constantly need the glitz and gleam of new stuff to keep that buzz going, right? Because that sheen loses itself. The mall has an unbelievable evangelistic program that is called marketing, right? And notice, how does apologies to any marketing students. We could talk about this seriously, because I'm not like anti-marketing. We can talk about it. But notice, for example, again, what I want you to realize is the mall knows you are not a thinking thing. The mall, more than anyone, knows you are not a thinking thing. The mall is not trying to convince your intellect. The mall is trying to capture your loves and longings. I like to say Victoria is in on Augustine's secret, right? So the way marketing works is, notice, for example, look at, since this is kind of targeted at your demographic, or once you graduate and have work, Volkswagen wants to sell you a car. Okay, specifically wants to sell you a car. And how does a Volkswagen ad work? Watch a Volkswagen ad from now on. There is no information about Volkswagens, right? They're not giving you any information that convince your intellect that, oh yeah, this is the specimen that you want. What is it? It's a story that embodies a Volkswagen as sort of the background of a way of life that you want. And the way the story works on you is it appeals to your imagination. It doesn't appeal to your intellect. And what we don't realize is that over time, this is shaping and forming not our intellectual convictions, but it is shaping our passional orientations, our loves and our longings, which are being habituated to a rival vision of the good life. The gospel of consumerism doesn't convince your intellect. It captures your imagination. And when it captures your imagination, it captures your loves, which means it's got you. And that didn't happen by you thinking through the process. So let me say, just very quickly, I'm sorry I've gone so long. Last piece of this picture then, why would this make a difference? First of all, I hope it wakes us up to a new way of analyzing our own cultural immersion. The last implication, I'll just say briefly, is this. It should also reframe then what we think Christian formation and discipleship looks like. Because if I am going to be rehabituated, right? If I'm going to sort of roll back those deformations of my love, I need new practices. I can't think my way out of deformed love, right? I could give you all the information. For example, the irony, of course, being that tonight all I've done is give you information. But that can be a catalyst then for you to reflect more intentionally on the practices that you are immersed in, and it can also be a catalyst for you to then immerse yourself in new regimens and repertoires of Christian practice, realizing now what's at stake. It's not like you're just doing this to show God something. You're doing this because those are the practices that God is getting hold of you and retraining your loves and longings. They are formative, they are reformative, they are transformative, right? And the way that, what you'll understand is at stake then, is you can't, think of it this way. When I'm reading Wendell Berry in Costco, the solution to get me to stop craving pizza at Costco is not reading more Wendell Berry. It's committing myself to different regimens of practice that form in me rightly ordered loves and longings. That is what Christian worship is supposed to be. The practices of intentional historic Christian worship are meant to be the incubators for rightly ordered love. That's the place where you relearn how to love. That's the place in which God invites you into these practices. Again, not just so that you can express your praise to God, but because God has committed to being in those practices and is actually molding and remaking you and bending your hearts back towards his kingdom. It's why the practices of Christian worship are the ways that God meets us as creatures of habit and gives us these gifts, not so we don't have to go look for the spiritual high. We don't have to find the right book. We don't have to wonder where's the right retreat that's going to solve all my problems. We need to commit ourselves to the ordinary means of grace, which are the channels by which the Spirit is channeling our heart. I'll stop there. Thanks very much. So we have some time for comments, questions, criticisms, queries, quizzical looks, clarifications. Yes, ma'am. Liturgies, yep. Yeah. Well, it depends where you go to college. And fortunately, I know very little about Barry, so if I step on anybody's toes, I apologize in advance, because I just honestly don't know. By the way, can I make a plug for a novel? By Tom Wolfe, called I Am Charlotte Simmons. Has anybody ever heard of this novel? It is the best study of the liturgies of the university I know of. He diagnoses at least 3. The stadium and the arena, the frat house, and actually the classroom comes third. Actually, no, it would be the stadium and the arena, the fraternity and sorority house, but mostly the frat house. Do you have Greek? No. Good for you. The residence halls, which have their own rhythms and routines and rituals, and then the classroom. And what's so interesting about Wolfe's analysis in I Am Charlotte Simmons is, you would think that the university is precisely a space where we are primarily thinking things. We're here to learn, we're here to think. Turns out that's not really true. Partly because we are never only thinking things, and actually the liturgies of the university are often, I'm thinking of, like, say, where am I, Georgia? I'm thinking of the University of Georgia, right? Think of how different the litanies and liturgies at the University of Georgia are than Barry, right? You can all feel the difference. Notice, each of them is loaded with, I think, very different visions of what you should love, right? I've been at Barry for 24 hours, and you could say I maybe got some rosy picture from the administration, but I would say I've picked up this vibe that actually, for example, Barry has litanies and rites that are training you in all kinds of unconscious ways about the gift of work and labor. Right? That's a really interesting litany that is not common at other universities. The liturgies of other universities revolve around pleasure, in some ways trying to put off learning as much as possible, and to succeed in a sort of party culture that are dominated by the quest for domination in athletics, the tribalism that goes with that, right? These are all things that you are learning at an unconscious level, and yet they tend to be the most overwhelming experiences of university for people who go to those kinds of schools. There would be another conversation we could have about the intellectual habits that you acquire at universities, which can also be, rightly ordered or disordered. But I just have a hunch that that's probably less crucial, only because I don't think there'd be the same temptations here. Does that help? That's not super concrete, but basically you have to start looking at, what are we implicitly valuing as the good life in the unspoken rights of our communities? It's that kind of analysis, yeah. Because you could do, if I do, for example, a liturgical analysis of, say, the football stadium, let's say professional football or something. To me, the idolatry at work there is not football, it's often militarism. Do you ever notice all the ways that there's a certain kind of military story that is now completely woven into professional athletics for us? Well, that's a story. There's a story that is embedded in that, and we are being immersed in that story. That's different. That's not. You understand? That's not the same as saying that the military is a problem. There's a difference between those two. If I say anything that upsets you, it's because I'm Canadian. Right? Just say communist, right, and just write it off. Other questions? Yes, sir.
What are some of the spiritual practices, or I guess specific spiritual practices that you were talking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. How about, so my work tends to focus on trying to get people to see particularly how the hub of gathered Christian worship sort of tells the story of the gospel in a unique way. So let me try this example. In historic Christian worship, right, which is the sort of narrative form of Christian worship that we inherit from the tradition, when Christians gather, they would always collectively and communally engage in confession of their sin together. And then after going through that discipline of confession, they would hear the announcement of God's mercy or forgiveness or absolution, right? So imagine that as a chapter in the narrative arc that is the practice of Christian worship. Now, why is that significant? First of all, I think it's significant because it means that the body of Christ is that unique community that actually doesn't think it's better than everybody else. It's not supposed to, because it'd be pretty odd to think that you're better than everybody else and yet make integral to your communal gatherings the confession that we have sinned by what we have done and by what we have left undone, right? So it's built into the self-narration of who we are. I also think, though, being immersed in that regular practice of confession cuts against the cultural liturgy that says, believe in yourself, you're awesome, you've got everything it takes. That kind of, vague cultural optimism and Pelagianism that we absorb. So that's a counterformative moment. Now, let me add one more layer to this. Mark Twain once said, "He who carries a cat by the tail learns something he can learn in no other way." He who carries a cat by the tail learns something he can learn in no other way. Now, what's Twain talking about? What he's saying is, imagine that I've carried a cat by the tail, and imagine that I have these incredible capacities for prose description, and I tell you exactly what it's like to carry a cat by the tail. I articulate that for you. That's never going to be the same as me saying, "Here, hold this cat." Right? Because there's something irreducible in the experience that you couldn't learn in any other way. So let me add one more layer to this. One of the reasons I think we need to think about spiritual disciplines that are also embodied, that meet us in the body. And historically, for hundreds and hundreds of years, when Christians have confessed their sins, they've also done so on their knees. Now, to me, this is sort of carrying the gospel by the tail, so to speak. You know, to confess my sin in this posture is to understand something about my humility before God in my bones, right? And then to hear the word of forgiveness in which Christ says, "Stand up. Stand up." That's also knowing something about forgiveness in my very bodily posture. Here I understand the gospel in ways I couldn't even put into words. And I think what we might not realize is how much that then sort of seeps into your imagination and shapes the way you inhabit the world. So, sorry, this is a long answer to your question. That's one example of a discipline. I also think we could talk about other kinds of spiritual disciplines, say that like Richard Foster and Dallas Willard and folks talk about, which tend to be a little bit more of individualistic. I'm trying to put these both together. So, you know, why is fasting a discipline, right? Because it teaches you something about learning to want, learning to hunger. But it does so in a way that isn't just intellectual, right? You're like, your belly's rumbling in the middle of the day and you're remembering something about that. Yeah. Is that helpful? Yeah. Well, there's lots more that could be said about that. Yes, sir.
Stanley Howell was here earlier.
Yeah.
And been reading The Peaceable Kingdom. If I understand his argument, I mean, it's an extended call for us to be people of peace, non-violent people. But he says, I think, that we learn that by becoming part of a story. And we learn that story by being part of a community. And so that community then shapes us. Is that the same thing as you're talking about your formative liturgy?
Totally. So let me put these together. And actually, Peaceable Kingdom was really influential for me. So love is a virtue, is a habit. And what that means is it's always oriented towards some end. And that's the sort of vision of flourishing that you think you're pursuing. The way I would articulate that in Stanley's terms is, a liturgy is loaded with a story that articulates the telos, right? I mean, that's the technical way of putting it. So the reason why liturgies form us and train us is precisely because the routines and the rituals are kind of loaded with a story about what flourishing is, about what the good life is. And what we just have to recognize is there are competing stories. We live in an age and we live in a space of very different competing stories about what does it look like to flourish. And so that's why we're always negotiating. We are always subject to multiple formations, so to speak. Does that help? Yeah, so totally. I sometimes describe liturgies as enacted stories, compressed narratives, right? Embodied narratives. And they are the story is always connected to some telos. Yeah, that's exactly right. Great. Yes, sir.
So you've talked about liturgies and spiritual disciplines as shaping our habit of love and
Yes.
at the kingdom.
Yes.
Where is, I think we talked a little bit about this before, where is the work of the Holy Spirit in this?
Knew this question was coming. So, I think of it this way. I mean, I'm not going to be, because part of me wants to push back and say, well, where was the Spirit otherwise? Do you know what I mean? Like what, because here's the thing. Even though I consider myself a charismatic Christian, right? Do you know what I mean? Like I'm deeply committed to the ways that the Spirit works above and beyond what we could ever ask or think. The Spirit is not magic, right? And there's a tendency for us to kind of end up with a pneumatology of the gaps, where we think, oh, we do what we can, and then the Spirit kind of makes up the difference in sort of magical ways. I would put it this way. The Spirit is in the practices that we're talking about. Craig Dykstra, great Presbyterian Christian educator for years, used to say that the Christian practices are habitations of the Spirit. They are the conduits and the channels of the Spirit's grace. So yeah, this is a very important question, because I don't want us to come away with a picture as if we have some sort of spiritual self-management mechanism here, right? Oh, if we just get all the practices in place, it's us doing it. No. The only reason why why these practices have the reformative potential that they do is precisely because these practices are the conduits for the Spirit's nourishing grace. And it's one of the reasons why, if you want to be transformed, it turns out you don't have to find this secret experience somewhere. You just have to avail yourself of the ordinary means of grace, right? You could be transformed and be bored at the same time. I'm serious, right? This isn't about tingly stuff, right? It's about the sort of unconscious reformation of your deepest desires. And that can be happening in ways that you might not even realize. So, yes, we rightly associate the Spirit with the miraculous and the surprising. I don't want to lose that. But the same Spirit that does miraculous, resurrecting surprises also makes the sun rise every day. And in the sort of spiritual analog of that is, yes, the Spirit will sometimes do incredible transformative experiences in your life, and He's there every Sunday, right? And is embedded and is at work in those ordinary means of grace. And I find that very liberating. Do you know, it means I don't have to frantically look around for the experience of the Spirit. I need to submit myself to the practices that the Spirit has given me. Yeah. So it's resisting the dichotomy between the two. Yeah. Yeah.
You talked about these unconscious cultural formative
Yeah.
energies.
Right.
Is there a way for us to become more aware
Yeah.
of those?
Yes. Hopefully, that is actually the one goal of the kind of reflection we're doing tonight, is that now you walk up. So this is why I considered it a small parenting win. When my son thinks he's mocking me, he's like, Dad, will you take me to the mall? I'm like, my work here is done. Or will you take me to the temple? Because that actually means I registered something somewhere. And it's like you walk in, and even at some sort of unconscious level, you're like, I know what you're trying to do to me. Now, I'm not saying that that's adequate in and of itself, but it's the beginning, I think, of sort of defanging the formative power of those practices. Because interestingly, I'm not advocating retreat and withdrawal. I don't think there are any pure spaces, right? So this is precisely why awareness is important, not seclusion. Because I actually think what happens in a lot of seclusion is we actually just end up with Christian-fied, Jesus-fied versions of the secular liturgies, right? That's Christian subculture, not counterculture. Yeah. Does that work? Great. Looks like we're done.
Yes.
Thank you.